After taking the world by storm in 2D and then coming back for a full 3D robot pirate adventure in the sequel, with both games selling pretty well, Rayman had cemented himself as a favourite of the platformer mascot character crowd, which couldn't have been easy as there were a lot of these guys popping up all over the place in the late 90s to mid 2000s. But it worked, and I still to this day think it's not only because the games were fun, but because Rayman's character design itself is just so unique. Even now I can mention Rayman to a couple family members of mine who don't even play video games, and yeah, they remember who I'm talking about. I think another thing that kind of shows how popular a character can be is the release of ports, side games, or spin-offs, which can kind of work for doing their own thing at times, but on the promise that your favourite characters are also going to be there too. I took as deep a dive as I could into the world of Rayman 2 ports last time, but it also got its own kind of spin-off racing game adventure with Rayman Arena, or Rayman M as it was called over here, which just sounds super lame. I don't know, my brain just kind of sees that and reads it as Raymanum, which is bad. But as far as the main games are concerned, of course we did eventually get Rayman 3, Hoodlum Havoc. This one is a little different to the last two though, in that it's the first time the series was made without Michel Ancel acting as the development team leader. He was a little busy with another team making a game called Beyond Good and Evil, which I've never played, so don't ask me about it because I have no idea. Back then, I didn't really know or care about any of that stuff. I just remember seeing a lot of marketing for Rayman 3 at the time. There was this really cool pre-rendered trailer for it at E3 one year, and then much closer to launch they had a bunch of these advertisements for it on TV.
Ready for action.
Yeah, ready when you are.
Rayman 3.
Oh, and they even did this one-off issue of a Rayman magazine, which I somehow still have. So, with all of that, and seeing all of the trailers and advertisements for it on TV, I was ready, and when the game finally launched, I just didn't get it. I mean, back then I was 10 years old and I didn't really buy games for myself, they were just given to me for birthday presents or whatever, and by the time that rolled around, I think I'd already played Rayman 3. I remember one of my friends getting it and we basically played through most, if not all of it, at his house over a weekend, so there was no point me wasting one of my birthday present wishes on something I'd already played. Eventually, I got it included with this PS2 box set of Rayman games, but even then, I've not really revisited this one for some reason. And before anybody comments about it, I'll just say that yes, there is a Game Boy Advance version of Rayman 3, which, despite the name, is not Rayman 3, but more importantly, the console version got a HD re-release on Xbox Live and PSN back in the day. And the Xbox version is still playable on the newer Xbox consoles too, if you care about that. But I'm not really going to do a deep dive into Rayman 3 HD. For me, the main appeal of doing that for Rayman 2 and its various ports were that they were all so different from one another, whereas the HD port of Rayman 3 is literally just a HD version of Rayman 3. If there are any differences here, they're probably not going to be significant enough for me to want to talk about, so I'm just going to sweep it under the rug. Out of the original trilogy, this is the one I've played through the least over the years, and because of that, it's the one I'm most looking forward to revisiting actually, because, I don't know, I guess it's a bit of a curiosity to me after all this time, so yeah, let's give it a go. Starting off, let's talk about the story. I'll go more into it as and when I need to, but starting out this time has us witness the rise of the Black Lums, this mischievous little collection of Lums who, after stealing some materials, stitch themselves together some scarecrow-looking clothing to become the Hoodlums. Such a good play on words, that is the perfect name for these guys. In sheer panic, Glowbox ends up running away with Rayman's hands in hand, and the game begins with us on the run as the first batch of Hoodlums try to gun Rayman down. For an initial opening scene, I do like where this is going, and from here we quickly see what kind of tone this game is going for, and yeah, it's pretty goofy at times. You know, like, Rayman 2 did lighten up about halfway through, but that was a fairly self-contained, dark and moody game for the most part, whereas this one, while there are some darker and maybe scarier areas in the world, there's this constant stream of jokes, references, and dumb comments being made by everyone, which I actually quite like for the most part. The Hoodlums, I think, are just the right balance between the serious tone of the previous game's villains and the goofiness of those rabbit things that took over the entire franchise in later years. Sometimes the Hoodlums can look like this, kind of scary and intimidating. And other times they're here, starring in a series of 547 DVDs that teach you how to kick Rayman's butt. But this really is going to be down to each person's tastes, because I can easily see a lot of people being annoyed by this from time to time, which can include me on occasion. I mean, I'm all for some silly fourth wall breaking and dumb humour at times, like this at the start of the game, where Murphy here, voiced by Billy West of all people, busts out the Rayman 3 manual in order to find out where the story is supposed to go next.
All this happiness in the beginning of the game. Something bad is gonna happen, I know it.
There's also this one part later on in the game which I liked, where after facing an impossibly powerful foe and defeating him, Rayman is given the power of Leptis. And this power is built up to be this huge important plot device, delivered onto the world through an ancient god that has watched over the Kanaran of the desert for all eternity. Now that power is being bestowed upon an outsider for the very first time, and it is just the goofy face thing that you could do in the first game where Rayman goes This is so stupid, but I can't help but love it, because what can I say? I like a dumb punchline after a long build-up. But there are other times where some of the stuff Glowbox does gets a little too much though. The guy has had a complete personality transplant from the scared but loyal friend he was in the previous game to just this complete friggin' idiot in Rayman 3. I mean, this guy is so stupid, and 90% of the time that is the punchline for the joke, which can get pretty exhausting, but for the most part it is kind of happening in the background as dialogue that happens during gameplay itself, which you'll just be focusing on that anyways, so I don't know, it is still a bit too much at times though. Like Billy West as Murphy, they got another bigger name in to do the voice of Glowbox, with John Leguizamo voicing him, which I mainly know him from being Luigi in that Super Mario Bros. Movie that has nothing to do with the source material. But you know what, I don't even care, because I'm one of the 3 people on this planet that actually like that movie, so whatever. Anyway, yeah, while you'll hear Glowbox all the way throughout the game, don't get too used to having Billy West around as Murphy, because he makes a swift exit after the first level.
See you in Rayman 4!
Now, while I do have something else to say about that introductory sequence, I feel like I've got to brush that aside for a bit while I talk about just how nice this game looks. Both on an artistic and technical level, I think they did a great job of giving Rayman's world the detail and colour it deserves. I guess the PS2 version of Rayman 2 got pretty close to what I'm talking about here, with some of the plant life looking more vivid, but that's just it. It was still a port of Rayman 2. This just feels a lot more like the shackles of the previous generation have been well and truly broken off here, because there's just so much more to it this time around, with it feeling a lot more like a bespoke next generation Rayman game in the graphics department. Well, you know, next generation at the time, obviously. But yeah, I mean, look at this. Early on you've got areas like this with such nice lighting and reflections, and not to mention some top-notch music throughout, with some of it being more like ambient noise than actual music when it needs to be, but still, it's pretty good. Our boy Rayman here has also had a slight redesign, and I've got to say, this is my favourite version of him, and this is the style that's basically stuck with him ever since, but it's still distinctly Rayman. It says a lot for that iconic design when all of these adjustments can be made, and it's still really on point with how he's always looked anyway, because yeah, that is still definitely Rayman. But as far as playing Rayman 3 goes, it's actually pretty good. I think the main thing to take into account with platformer games of this era, especially with a series that transitioned from 2D to 3D, is that for the most part, by the time you get that first 3D game out of the way, the really difficult job of making that transition was already done. Obviously, most of those games need a little more refinement after the first attempt, but there's no need to reinvent the wheel, you've just got to try and improve upon what you already had. It just so happens that Rayman 2 ended up being a pretty good foundation to build upon anyway. So yeah, Rayman 3 also went down the avenue of combat-focused 3D platforming, with a few bits of other gameplay styles sprinkled in here and there for good measure. And for the most part, I would say it kind of works out pretty well. On the platforming side of things, Rayman's default moveset is maybe even more simple than it was last time, with his basic jumps, ledge grabs, and of course his trademark helicopter hair. Instead of being on a toggle like in Rayman 2, this time the helicopter hair is done by holding down the jump button, which I actually think works a lot better within the context context of this game. Rayman 2 made a big deal about some of these big downward corridors to maybe show off how big some of these newfangled 3D environments could be, whilst still having creative camera work and actually being gameplay to prove it's all running in real time. This time, the effort went more into making the environments more detailed, the levels more condensed, and what platforming you do is going to be more of just that, actually jumping to and from platforms. There is a need to use the helicopter hair from time to time, but it's just done in a way where the new control scheme seems a lot more appropriate. The other thing is that while there is a good amount of platforming here, I would say Rayman 3 does lean into the combat a little more than ever before, which, well, combat is like the biggest coin flip of most 3D platformers out there. Some do it pretty well, and others not so much, and yeah, there's not really much need to worry about it here because Rayman 2 already did this pretty well anyway, so Rayman 3 comes back and knocks it out of the park. This combat is a lot of fun. So what's going on here is you've got the same kind of ranged combat that Rayman 2 had, but with a much more focused lock-on system, and that range has been dialed back a bit now because Rayman actually uses his hands again. Yeah! Don't get me wrong, I think Rayman 2 is a solid game, but why did they make him shoot balls out of his hands? It felt so off-brand. This time, it's as it should be, back to throwing fists into faces, which is all well and good, but it does help that this whole lock-on combat system in general feels so much smoother and more fleshed out now. Locking the camera onto an enemy will allow Rayman to throw curved punches, which is necessary for a few enemy types because some of them are able to block attacks from the front or even the sides, with you having to mix it up a bit depending on who you're going up against. And yeah, you do actually have to mix things up quite a lot throughout the game because there are loads of hoodlums to take on. Rayman 2 tried to do this towards the end with a few different types of robot pirates, but that mostly came down to some of them being able to shoot faster than others. This time we've got a whole cast of hoodlums in all kinds of shapes and sizes, with all of them needing a slightly different tactic that you have to use against them. So you've got the regular hoodlums that will shoot their rifles. You can pretty much punch these guys however you like. You've got these commandos, which you can still hit however you like, but they'll shoot multiple shots each time. Then you've got these colourful guys that'll throw explosives at Rayman from a distance and even turn up on stilts from time to time. Then you've got these little flying hoodlum dudes that move all around the place and you have to shoot them from different angles. These shield-bearing hoodlums that spawn even smaller enemies from underneath while they block your attacks unless you attack them from multiple directions in quick succession. Oh, and then you've got these friggin' big guys that wear armor that Rayman can't even damage unless you grab some extra firepower. But I think the best enemy in terms of shaking up your tactics has to be this guy, the Hoodoo. He's a kind of mystical sorcerer hoodlum that shows up from time to time, and he'll protect another hoodlum within that combat encounter. So what you have to do is attack the one that's being protected to draw the Hoodoo out and then quickly punch him in the face before he disappears again. It is so good. All of this is going on alongside the smoother movement controls and little improvements here and there, like being able to independently charge your punch, so you can still jump around whilst charging it up, which, yeah, you couldn't do that in Rayman 2. So all of this makes each combat encounter an active and engaging bit of gameplay. And this is where I admire Rayman 3, because the combat is where it can all go wrong. I think to do enemies right in these kind of games, you've either got to make each encounter with them one of two things. Either make it so it's over fairly quickly, with the enemy being more like an avoidable obstacle, or make it something more active, where you'll be using the commands you'd already be using for the platforming side of gameplay, but in a slightly different way, like in Rayman 3 here. Yeah, so from what I've played, it seems pretty easy for a game to fall into that trap of making you press the same button over and over again to ensure you don't die, so I'm pretty glad Rayman 3 didn't fall down there, but let's be real, because this is a follow-up to Rayman 2, which, like I said earlier on, they had a pretty good foundation to build upon with this game, so I guess the main thing I'm trying to say here is that I'm glad Rayman 3 didn't somehow screw that up. If that wasn't enough, there's also a bunch of other things Rayman can do, some of which come straight from his extended moveset in Rayman 2, thanks to these power-ups, which come in the form of these friggin' canisters of magical clothing detergent. Yeah, this is actually a pretty fun idea. I certainly can't think of any other games that give you powers through magical clothing detergent, and I think it fits in with the world of Rayman 3 just fine, and if you don't, then you can just... Anyway, each one of these not only gives Rayman a new ability, but I also really like the way it palette swaps his normal colour scheme to match whatever it may be. First of all, you've got the green costume, which gives Rayman his Vortex Fist. This is able to spin platforms around, get rid of those hoodlums on the stilts, and in general combat you can use it to shrink enemies down and finish them off by walking over them, which is pretty fun. You get a nice little splat sound effect whenever you do that. Next up, you've got the red canister containing the Heavy Metal Fist, which I would say was the poster boy power-up of Rayman 3, which ironically I do actually have a poster of. Go figure. This was the one they used in a lot of the marketing, and it does what you would expect it to do. You can use this one to increase Rayman's punching power for taking down armored hoodlums and smashing these big doors down. Then you've got the blue canister containing the Lockjaw, which was the other power-up you'd see in a lot of the marketing for Rayman 3. This was the one that ended up on the front of the box after all, at least here in the UK anyway. You can use this one in combat for an electrical shot, but more importantly, it brings back the swinging mechanic from the last game with these flying metal hooks doing the same thing as the purple lums in Rayman 2. Yeah, I'm really glad this is here because I always thought it was fun in Rayman 2, so yeah, I'm glad it's here in Rayman 3. After that, there's a couple more canisters with the orange and yellow ones containing the shock rocket and the throttle copter. These give Rayman the ability to remotely control his fist for some strategic button pressing or cage breaking or whatever, and the other one gives Rayman the ability to temporarily fly. All of these power-ups are handled differently to how they were in both previous games, with each ability only being given to you for about as long as you will actually need them for, instead of, you know, the magical fairy coming along and just giving you a new power to keep for the rest of the game. This time you'll just get the thing that you need and quickly make use of it before it disappears, but whenever you get one of these power-up canisters, it will stay where it landed, so you can always go back to it and top up your timer if you need to. Sometimes you'll get these from hoodlums in any of the combat scenarios, and you'll know which one thanks to a dollar symbol over their head, but sometimes you'll get given a power-up as a reward for doing that age-old Rayman thing of smashing open cages.
Thanks, Big Nose!
While most of these cages are on the path you'll be taking through the levels anyway, there are a few hidden ones in and around little hiding places here and there. And yeah, I think it's pretty good to see these back, as I think they're one of those key elements of a Rayman game at this point, and they're a great fit for somebody who can throw their fist around to break them open. The cages on the critical path through each level will give you exactly what you need in order to progress through it, whereas the other ones will just give you some sparkly gems or something like that you'll get points for, which don't really do anything for me, but I'll go more into that in a second. My favourite collectibles though are these little critters that have their own sound cues. If you hear this little guy calling out, you can use the first person view to zoom in on him, and then he'll wave at the camera and disappear. And then you've got these red guys that'll make another noise where you have to slowly walk up to them so you don't scare it away. Aside from them adding to the score count as well, they don't really do anything though, which is a shame because they're kind of well hidden and I find them fun to come across. The blue guy in particular, I would always stop whatever it was I was doing just so I could try and find him. So yeah, unlike any of the other mainline entries, Rayman 3 has an entire arcade scoring system for some reason. Pretty much anything you do, like punching enemies, collecting gems, breaking open cages, and whatever else, will add to the score, and if you do things in quick succession, they'll get added to the score meter twice as a reward for keeping up a combo. The scoring system is fine enough, and I guess it is kind of cool to prioritize certain actions in a way that maximizes the amount of points you'll get, because these do all add up towards unlocking some extra cutscenes and bonus levels, but you can largely just ignore all of this if you want to. It really is one of those things where it doesn't really affect the gameplay so much as your gameplay can affect it if you want it to. So because of that and how I don't really care all that much for it, I do kind of wish the scoring meter would disappear after a few seconds, or maybe if you at least had the option to just make it not be there literally all the time in the corner of the screen, that would be pretty good, but yeah, there's nothing like that in here. Anyway, yeah, the power-ups. Normally, I am a fan of how it was done originally, where you'd get to keep the new power-up for the rest of time, especially if it means more fun ways to mess around in the world after getting some new way to play around with it. But Rayman's never really done that, save for the odd moment here and there, and I've got to give this game props because it does make make the whole time-limited power-up thing a lot of fun, really. All of the power-ups have their own specific uses outside of combat, which makes for some fun, visually identifiable things, like needing to grab one power-up to maybe spin some platforms, before then needing to use another to smash a door open, all surrounded by waves of hoodlums who'll drop those power-up canisters you need in the first place. It kind of makes these areas feel like a little bit of a puzzle without them actually being a puzzle, or like it's diving into weird minigame territory too often. This kind of stuff is definitely at its best towards the end of the game, where you're constantly swapping out the power-ups and using them to get through areas like this in quick succession. The bonus here is that the vast majority of the power-ups get recontextualized when you're in and out of combat as well, so they're not just suddenly going to get thrown away because you're fighting some bad guys or if you're platforming. I'm impressed. This, along with the kind of acrobatic platformer combat in general, works out really well, and you're quickly introduced to how all of this stuff works fairly early on. I mean, not every single power-up is going to be given to you within that first level, but the general way they work on a timer and being able to use them both in and out of combat, yeah, that's taught to you right there in the Fairy Council level. Outside of the regular enemy encounters, you'll also come across a few bosses throughout Rayman 3, with them mostly appearing at the end of each level. Although the way this game is structured, it kind of feels more like that's happening at the end of a set of levels, but either which way, I would say most of the bosses here are kind of basic, because you don't really have to do all that much to defeat them. Take this guy for instance. You've got this giant robotic walker thing stomping around on the hillside where you eventually fight him underwater. It looks really cool, but you just defeat this guy by redirecting some rockets towards it. It's really not difficult or complicated at all. And then you've got this other one where you go up against a witch in the middle of a house where there's a big cauldron full of magic potion. And I really do like that spilling the magic potion works both ways, because both you and the witch get turned into frogs depending on how you play this out. But yeah, aside from that, you're not really doing all that much here. You just kind of run around in circles, so it's a shame that this idea is stuck to such a small area. On the plus side, I actually really liked the first one of these bosses you come across, with this random legless hoodlum stomping around on a giant pair of stilts or mechanized legs or something. I don't know what these are. I mean, the fight against him isn't all that much. You just push 3 buttons and then fire a rocket towards his face, but the payoff for doing that was a lot of fun. You get to take the mechanized legs for yourself and then stomp around on a bunch of hoodlums. All the time you've got this sports commentator talking over everything like it's a highlight reel, and yeah, this was a lot of fun. It made me smile.
Local favorite Rayman is on hand to settle the score with the Hoodlums.
Later on in the game, there is one fairly decent boss fight against this guy, Reflux, champion of the Kanaran. And yeah, I would say this is probably the best boss battle throughout the entire game, because it sticks to what is so fun about the regular combat, but cranks everything up to 11 with a constant need for attacking and dodging, and using a certain power-up along the way. It is this kind of frantic and acrobatic combat that I think Rayman 3 does really well after all. It's also just really fun to have this one actually set up in this sort of big gladiator arena with a full-on drum beat to keep the pace up, and I like the way the camera pulls all the way back to show you the sheer size of this guy compared to Rayman. But after that, and way later on into the game, I do have some issues with one of the boss fights in particular, but I'll just keep that to myself for a little bit longer. Trust me, I will get to it though. In the meantime, without going into that stuff that happens at the end, let's talk more about the story beyond the introduction. Unlike Murphy, I can't show you the manual to give you a synopsis because my stupid Rayman box set thing here didn't even come with any of the manuals for any of the games. Anyway, here's what happens in Rayman 3. After that initial opening sequence of escaping the first hoodlums, it doesn't take long for the rest of them to spread out and become an army all of their own. When the leader of the bunch gets separated from his hoodlum costume, he says he's heading to the heart of the world so he can use its energy to multiply infinitely. But on the way there, he accidentally gets swallowed by Glowbox. This creates the problem of Andre still being alive and stuck inside Glowbox, so the rest of the game is mostly about trying to find different doctors spread out across the world who might be able to cure Glowbox of his problem. All the while, the hoodlums make our heroes public enemy number 1 for kidnapping their leader. And yeah, I think this is a pretty good enough reason for the story to keep on going. You know, it makes sense to go to all of these different places because of that. It's also pretty fun seeing Glowbox deal with some of the side effects of swallowing Andre, because Andre likes to mess around around with him at times. Every now and then, Glowbox will be forced to drink a barrel of plum juice to satisfy Andre's cravings, and yeah, Glowbox is allergic to plum juice, so it makes him do weird things.
Check it out, Rayman. I'm flying. This rules. Yee-haw!
And throughout Rayman 3, I did enjoy seeing all of the stupid little ways the doctors try and cure Glowbox, like one starts playing a guitar on his arm and another one starts doing this crazy drum solo. I'm not gonna lie, the story here is actually pretty good. Well, I mean, it's as good as it needs to be, anyway. There is a threat to the world here, nothing as bleak and sinister as it felt in Rayman 2, but I do like that the situation here has kind of created itself, with the big bad guys being even more bad as the game goes along because the stupid blue frog guy accidentally imprisoned their leader. But surrounding the story and everything else I've mentioned so far, there's the other bits of gameplay. Not the other bits of gameplay, because I've already talked about those. The other bits of gameplay. Oh, come on, you know exactly what I mean, because all of these old school platformer games have this nonsense. Not the platforming, not the combat, this kind of thing. But in order to talk about the first one in Rayman 3, we've got to go back, way back to the start of the game.
The manual. It's all in here. If you read the story, you'll find your way out.
No, not here. Even further back. Perfect. This is exactly where we need to be. So once you hit start on the main menu and watch the intro cutscene, I swear this is one of the most random and stupid decisions I think I've ever seen in a game like this. The very first thing you do in Rayman 3 Hoodlum Havoc, the action platformer game, of all things, is this on-rails bit where you just lean left and right towards the red lums, and if you miss one, you have to circle around and do it all again until you get them all. And yeah, I don't know what to say about this, like... Why would you start the game doing this? Not only are you not doing either one of the things that this game is all about, but it's also a gameplay style that literally never shows up again. At all. You never do this again throughout the entire game. I get that they're maybe trying to show you that the red lums give you health, but Rayman 2 did this with a sliding section at the start of that game, which is excusable because it's a thing that you do throughout Rayman 2 quite often. It's one of the things that that game is known for. Meanwhile, in Rayman 3, you start out with this, but afterward you've got an area where you can find red lums on the ground while you're freely able to move around like you do in the rest of the game. And it happens right after you do that first section, so I don't know what's going on here. Somebody somewhere made a really friggin' weird decision. Anyway, another thing that comes up from time to time is this sort of bumper cart gameplay, which it kind of presents itself as a power-up because there's a little collectible thing that glows and you have to grab it, but it's not like the other power-ups at all. You just touch the shoe icon and then Rayman will shrink down and drive one of his shoes around while you try and make it hit the other one for some reason. I don't hate this gameplay because it's fine enough for what it is, and it doesn't happen too often, and I do like seeing levels from this new shrunken down perspective, but I can't shake the fact that this is nowhere near as good as those shell riding sections from Rayman 2. I mean, how can you not compare them? It's kind of the same thing, really. Except in Rayman 2, these were so fun. You do loop-de-loops and go up walls all around and upside down. These were a freaking blast. I wish Rayman 2 had even more of these, to be honest. And the shell itself became a big reason Rayman was even able to defeat the final boss last time. The damn thing had a personality. Now, you just kind of go around and bonk the other shoe a few times, and there's really no real reason for it other than you finishing the bumper cart battle and then being given the power-up that you actually need to progress through the level most of the time, which kind of stands out like a sore thumb against some of the other things Rayman 3 has you doing. You've also got these funky hoverboard sections that come up from time to time. I'm not super crazy about these, as some of the jumps can be a little finicky. It's mainly the weight of the hoverboard itself, because it drops down like it's made of a bunch of house bricks. But you can't deny that these sections are a treat for the eyes, and the music here is actually really good, so yeah, whatever. And of course, we've got this last thing, which, yeah, I thought they would manage to avoid this because there wasn't a single instance of it in Rayman 2, but yep. We've got turret sections in Rayman 3. On the plus side, this does only happen twice, and the first time it does isn't that bad, because you're mixing it up a bit between the turret section and this flying car stuff, which is, you know, it's a less fun version of that final level from Rayman 2, but whatever. Now, the second time this turret section gameplay shows up, well, this is where we have a bit of a problem, because I would say it happens a little too late in the game for my liking. Like, way, way too late into the game for me to just brush over it. Incidentally, let's talk about the ending of Rayman 3. Yeah, so spoilers if you care about seeing the ending of Rayman 3, I guess. After finally getting to a doctor that cures Glowbox of his black lum-infested brain, Andre makes a run for it and teams up with Reflux, the previously undefeated champion of the Kanaran. The two of them then work together as there's a mutual benefit to it, with Reflux getting a second chance to destroy Rayman, and Andre will be able to use an ancient Kanaran power to multiply infinitely and take over the world, which really would be quite bad. Story-wise, I think this is all fine enough really, and I do like that Andre has been paying attention to everything the heroes were doing up until this point to know that he would have an ally with Reflux. And all of the levels leading up to the end from this point on are pretty good too. There's this entire Hoodlum hideout area that eventually explodes, and you have a proper Rayman 2 styled race against time to escape from it, which was a lot of fun. Then you've got this snowboarding section, which I didn't really think much of because the controls weren't that great, but it also does the same thing the intro to this game did, where you have to start all over again if you mess it up, and I'm never a fan of this kind of thing. And then you have that first turret section I mentioned earlier on, which in isolation it isn't too bad because you are doing a few other things to mix that up a bit. The final boss, however, it's pretty close to being a really good fight with multiple phases, all requiring you to do some different styles of combat and platforming to try and reduce Reflux's power, using all manner of power-ups in quick succession at times, which is great because this is one of those things I think Rayman 3 does pretty well. And then it happens. At the 11th hour, Rayman 3 in its final moments, and the actual last thing you do in the entirety of this video game is a turret section. Okay, if I'm being real about it for a second, then yeah, you're technically not doing the turret section at the very end of the game because you are alternating between it and whatever this is, where you fire bombs down towards the ground, but either which way, I wouldn't want to do either of these things at the very end of the game. I mean, where's the big victory moment for Rayman? Yeah, the good guys do eventually win, but the whole final part of this game just feels like it went against what made the rest of it fun. To me, what should have happened is to have all of this stuff cut down so it's a little shorter in general, or maybe just remove that last phase entirely so you still get to see this bigger, more powerful form of the final boss, but then have Reflux lose his power. Not all of it, just enough to shrink him down to his regular size, and then we take him on in another gladiator-styled fight, but this time using all of the power-ups in one final phase. Maybe use the throttlecopter to fly up to a balloon that launches you into a lockjaw swing where you have to then use a special gold variant of the heavy metal fist. I don't know, just something a little closer to what the game was generally about up until this point, you know? Instead, we're just doing these two completely random styles of gameplay, one of which, like the introduction to Rayman 3, doesn't show up ever again, so yeah, great. Anyway, once all is said and done, the black lums turn back into red ones, Rayman and Glowbox finally get to have a full night's sleep, and then there's a little flashback scene to show you how Andre came to be in the first place. Roll credits. Yeah, that bit at the very end definitely wasn't very good. I don't know what it is with this game where it makes you do something completely random at the very start and the very end that has nothing to do with anything, but that aside, I can't really let it take away from the fact that I think we've got a pretty good game here. Yeah, this is the mainline Rayman game I've played the least over the years, and I kind of went into it unsure as to what I was getting into in terms of the quality, but yeah, it's actually not that bad. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that this one has the clear vision or direction that Rayman 2 had, and you can kind of tell there was a shake-up in the team developing this entry, which there was, and there is definitely a fair amount of Rayman 3 that could have done with a little bit longer in the game development oven, but overall I had a great time with this. The combat in particular is a major step up and is exactly what it should be in a game like this, keeping the player engaged by basically doing what they would have been doing anyway, but done in a slightly different context. You know, instead of that button-mashy bullshit you see so often in other platformer games. The real shame here, though, is the only way was up, as generally speaking, I think Rayman 3 was a step in the right direction, and that maybe just one more game in a similar style to this, taking elements from all three games, like having each of the villains return and team up against Rayman, that would have been awesome. We would have had this massive, visually and musically diverse game with some of the best mechanics from across the trilogy, all slapped together into a crazy new 3D Rayman adventure. But, of course, that was not meant to be, because Hoodlum Havoc was the last of the 3D Rayman platformers. And yeah, I know, we got some more recent 2D stuff with Origins and Legends, both of which are actually really good games, but I'm sorry, I like 3D platformers.
After all was said and done with Rayman 3, however, well, we all know which one came next.
And yeah, it would be really easy for me to poke fun at this game because, you know, the general consensus is that the Rabbids are shit, but I actually wouldn't mind playing this for what it is sometime and maybe looking at it for a video. Not right now though, but it's just an idea for another day.
But yeah, as far as Rayman 3 is concerned, I am done with it, and while it's not the best game I've ever played by any means, it's pretty good, and it's a real shame that this was the last one of its kind within this franchise.